Yeah, so I was here on the stage last year with Morehshin Allahyari introducing our Additivism project, and that did end up in the production of a cookbook. So it's very exciting to be here. I want to thank Sonic Axe for so many things, but you stand on the stage and you say you feel privileged and honored to be part of a festival. But when it comes to Sonic Axe, I really do feel that privilege, just the way that you are treated here and the way that it's to be invited back and to continue the conversation is a real honor. So thank you so much. So I'm going to be talking about monsters, specifically one monster from one piece of science fiction. I just want to paraphrase something that was in the Donna Haraway film yesterday, because I think this really sums up what I'm going to try and do today. And Donna Haraway says in her film that science fiction, it's not an illustration, but it is thinking itself. It is the process of transformative thinking transforming itself. And that's really what I want to do today, to kind of let the science fiction do the thinking for us, for me, and kind of perform through that. And I should warn you, there's going to be some goo and gore on screen today, but Zach Blass set us up nicely for that, so hopefully you're all ready. This slide was in our presentation last year, and I will be ending on this slide as well. It's a quote from Rosie Braidotti, in which she says that science fiction horror is a disturbance of cultural norms, and it is ideally placed to represent states of crisis and change and to express the widespread anxiety of our times. As such, this genre is as unstoppable as the transformations it mirrors. So I want you to think about the monster that I'm going to be talking about as a form of transformation itself, as a set of metaphors, as a set of principles for kind of modes of action and modes of thinking. And as I say, I'm going to come back to this, but I'm very interested in kind of pushing the metaphor of this monster as far as I can into as many different possible places. Okay. John Carpenter's 1982 film, The Thing, is a claustrophobic science fiction thriller exhibiting many hallmarks of the horror genre. The film depicts a sinister turn for matter, where the chaos of the replicating cancerous cell is expanded to the human scale and beyond. We watch as an alien force terrorizes an isolated Antarctic outpost. The creature exhibits an awesome ability to imitate, devouring any form of life it comes across, while simultaneously giving birth to an exact copy in a burst of bile and protoplasm. The thing copies cell by cell in a process so perfect that the resultant simulacrum speaks, acts, and even thinks like the original. The thing is so relentless and its copies so perfect that the outpost's doctor, Blair, is sent mad at the implications. And here he is smashing up the computers in the communication system in the camp. And he shouts, "If a cell could get out, it could imitate everything on the face of the earth, and it's not going to stop." Based on John W. Campbell's 1938 novella, Who Goes There?, Carpenter's film revisits a Gothic trope that is numerous in its incarnations. In Campbell's novella, the thing is condensed as much from the minds of the men as from its own horrific, defrosting bulk. A slowly surfacing nightmare that transforms alien matter into earthly biology also has the effect of transferring the inner, mental lives of the men into the resultant condensation. John W. Campbell knew that the thing could become viscous human flesh, but in order to truly imitate its prey, the creature must infect inner life separately, pulling kicking and screaming ghosts out of their biological Cartesian machines. As a Gothic figure, Campbell's thing disrupts the stable and integral vision of human being, self-same bodies housing unitary and securely bounded subjectivities, identical and extensive throughout time. His characters confront their anguish at being embodied. Their nightmares are literally made flesh. To emphasize the otherness of each human's flesh, Campbell's story is inhabited exclusively with male characters. The absence of women makes the conflict between each of the men feel more rudimentary, but it also centers the novel's horror on the growing realization that to be human is also to be alien to oneself. Differences between the sexes within the single species Homo sapiens are bypassed, allowing the alien entity to exhibit the features of human female otherness alongside a gamut of horrific bodily permutations. Perhaps, as Barbara Creed and Rosie Braidotti have argued, the thing signifies the intrinsic absence of the mother figure, the female body's capacity to be differentiated from itself in the form of pregnancy, to open up and usher forth into the world a creature other to itself. This thingly quality is given credence by Julia Kristeva in a passage that could equally refer to the thing as to the development of a fetus during pregnancy. And obviously, Julia Kristeva is not talking about the thing here, but this is her quote about pregnancy. Cells fuse, split, and proliferate. Volumes grow. Tissues stretch. And the body fluids change rhythm, speeding up or slowing down. With the body growing as a graft, indomitable, there is another, and no one is present within that simultaneously dual and alien space to signify what is going on, end quote. The thing does exhibit demeanors of copulation and fertility, but also of disease, fragmentation, dismemberment, and asexual fission. In the novella, during a drug-induced nightmare, Dr. Copper sits bolt upright and blurts out, "Gary, listen, selfish, from hell they came, and hellish shellfish. I mean self. Do I? What do I mean?" Macready turns to the other men in the cabin, "Selfish." And as Dr. Copper said, every part is a whole. Every piece is self-sufficient, an animal in itself. The thing is aberrant at a level more fundamental than allusions to pregnancy can convey. Dr. Copper's inability to articulate what the thing is indicates a categorical nightmare he and the men are suffering. As in the work of Mary Douglas, the thing's nightmarish transformation denies the very concept of physical and categorical purity. The things, we saw this earlier today, coincidentally in Zach's talk. The thing's distributed biology calls to mind the Hart and Negri's vision of the early internet, designed according to them, quote, to withstand military attack. Since it has no center and almost any portion can operate as an autonomous whole, the network can continue to function even when part of it has been destroyed. The same design elements that ensures survival, the decentralization, is also what makes control of the network so difficult, end quote. The image of mankind's outright destruction via totalizing narratives such as nuclear war, viral pandemic, or meteor strike is undermined by the paradigm of a thingly technological infrastructure designed to avoid absolute assault. Decentralization is a categorical horror in its capacity to highlight our self-same, constantly threatened and weak embodied selves. But shift the lens away from the self-same human subject, and the image of a distributed, amorphous network of autonomous cells immediately becomes a very good description of how biological life has always been constituted. The metaphysical dualism of the sexes, as Kelly Hurley concludes, is an inadequate paradigm of such horrific embodiment. Rather, any and all ontological security is challenged through a collapsing of multiple and incompatible morphic possibilities into one amorphous embodiment. The thing is neither male nor female, two nor one, inside nor outside, living nor dead. If it does settle into a form that can be exclaimed, screamed, or defined in mutually incompatible words, it does so only for a moment, and only in the minds of its onlookers as they scrabble to deduce its next amorphous conflation. The thing is a figure performing ontogenesis, which is something coming to be, rather than ontology, something that already is. The very definition of the real, as Jean Baudrillard affirmed, has become that of which it is possible to give an equivalent reproduction. Does the thing produce something other than human life, or reproduce human life in its entirety? And what, if anything, would be the difference? In a text on bio and necropolitics, Eugene Thacker undertakes an examination of the difference between life as an ontological foundation and the living, or the various specific instantiations of life. Thacker highlights a passage in Poetics where Aristotle speaks of mimesis giving rise to the art of poetry in human beings, and this is from Aristotle. We take delight in viewing the most accurate possible images of objects which in themselves cause distress when we see them, e.g. the shapes of the lowest species of animal and corpses." End quote. Recognition of mimetic forms can instill a certain degree of displeasure if that form depicts a carcass or something considered equally abhorrent. But this is often tinged with what Aristotle calls the extremely pleasurable dual capacities of recognizing an imitation as such, whilst at the same time recognizing what it is the form is imitative of. The horror of the thing is bound to this endless ontogenetic reforming, its limitless capacity to imitate and become without necessarily settling into a final, stable, and agreeable, categorical, that is, ontological form. The men of the Antarctic encampment grasp in their minds at the forms ushering from the thing, but can never keep up with its propensity toward the next shapeless shape, bodiless limb, or ontogenetic extrudence. The thing is a phenomenon, to use Eugene Thacker's words once more, that is at once above and below the scale of human being, throwing, as Rosie Braidotti puts it, a terminal challenge toward a human identity that is commonly predicated on the one. The other of the thing never settles down, always falling outside the dialectical circle. As Helen Sissou remarks in The Newly Born Woman, with the truly other, there is nothing to say. It cannot be theorized. The other escapes me. The figure of the thing bursts into popular culture at the meeting point between dream and flesh, and has been pursued ever since by men, and I specifically say men, whose individuality is considered inseparable from their self-same embodiment. By modifying the rules through which dominant norms such as gender binaries operate, the thing can be conceived as an incarnation of détournement, an intervention that hijacks and continually modifies the rule of engagement. The radical implication being that all meaning is connected to a relationship with power. Considered through Michel Foucault's definition of biopower, or the biopolitical, the thing is the process of sex and sexuality severed from the humans who are forced to proliferate through it. Above all, the men set against this propagation, this mobilization of images of other, scramble to protect the normative image of the human they hold most dear, the mirage of man. So now I'm going to show you the bloody blood and guts bit. This is just a couple of minutes. Hopefully the sound is ready to go here. Okay.
Clear!
Clear.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
Okay, so we get the point, right? And it's just worth pointing out, I'm not going to talk about this in much length, but the character Norris, who is on the table having his heart pumped, he has died, his heart has stopped, and they're trying to bring him to life. So the thing has replicated him to such a point that it's even replicated his heart valve being faulty and enacted his death. And even Norris doesn't know that he is the thing. Only when he is threatened, when the body is threatened, does the thing erupt and show itself. So, the filmic thing is a fictional device enabled by animatronic augmentations coated with fleshy stand-ins, KY jelly, and occasionally real animal offal. As John Carpenter described his rendition of the creature in a 2014 interview, it's just a bunch of rubber on the floor. Bringing the thing to life is an activity that performs the collapse between life as an ontological foundation and the living, or the various specific instantiations of life. The animatronic thing exists in the space between stable forms. It is vibrant, expressive technology realized by dead matter, and human ingenuity made discernible by uncanny machinic novelty. Ontological uncertainty finds fluidity in language on a page, in the ability to poetically gesture towards interstitiality. But on-screen animatronics, rubber and KY jelly, are less fluid, perhaps, more mimetically rooted by the expectations of the audience, reveling in and reviled by their recognition of the thing's many forms. Upon its release, critical reactions to John Carpenter's The Thing were at best muted and at worst downright vitriolic. The special effects used to depict the creature were the focus of an attack by Steve Jenkins. Jenkins attacks the film essentially for its surrealist nature, and he writes that, with regards to the effects, they completely fail to, quote, clarify the weirdness of the thing, and that because no one is ever sure exactly how the alien, functions, its eruptions from the shells of its victim seem as arbitrary as they are spectacular. In short, the reviews lingered on two opposing readings of the thing's shock gore evocations, that they go too far and tend towards sensational fetishism, or that they can't go far enough, depicting kitsch sensibilities rather than alien otherness. Jenkins' concern that the special effects do not clarify the thing's weirdness is contradictory, if not oxymoronic. The implication is that things could never be so weird as to defy logical function, and that all expressions should, and eventually do, lend themselves to being read through some parochial mechanism or other, however surreal they may at first seem. That the thing's nature could actually defy comprehensibility is not considered, nor how impossible the cinematic depiction of that defiance might be. Rather, the critical view seems to be that every grisly eruption, bifurcation, and horrific permutation on screen must necessarily express an inner order, temporarily hidden from, but not inaccessible to, its human onlookers. The critical desire for a norm defies the same critical desire for true horror. Our will to master matter and technology through imitative forms is the same will that balks at the idea that imitative forms could have ontologies incommensurable with our own. The thing is weird, a term increasingly applied to those things defying categorization. A conviction, so wrote the late Mark Fisher, that this does not belong is often a sign that we are in the presence of the new, that the concepts and frameworks that we have previously employed are now obsolete. In reflecting on the origins of this slippy anti-category, Eugene Thacker reminds us that within horror, the threat is not the monster or that which threatens existing categories of knowledge. Rather, it is the nameless thing, or that which presents itself as a horizon for thought. The weird is the discovery of an unhuman limit to thought that is nevertheless foundational for thought. In the thing, the world rises up to meet its male inhabitants in a weird form, and by becoming them, throws into question the categorical foundations of the born and the made, of subject and object, natural and synthetic, whole and part, human and world, original and imitation. What remains is an ongoing process of animation, rendered horrific by a bifurcation of ontologies. On the one side, the supposed human foundation of distinction, uniqueness, and autonomy, and on the other, a thingly, alien, and weird propensity that dissolves differentiation, that coalesces and revels in an endless process of becoming. As in Mikhail Bakhtin's study of the grotesque, the human horizon in question is that of the canon, a norm to which all aberrations are to be compared. And this is Bakhtin. The grotesque body is a body in the act of becoming. It is never finished, never completed. It is continually built, created, and builds and creates another body. Moreover, the body swallows the world and is itself swallowed by the world. End quote. The thingly is neither self-same nor enclosed unto itself. It is a plethora of openings, conjoinings, and eruptions that declare the world as eternally unfinished, a world dying and being born at the same time. The bodily horror performed by the thing is an allegory of this greater interstitial violation. The conceptual boundary between the world for us and the world without us is breached, not as destruction or even invasion, but ultimately through our inability to separate ourselves from a world that is already inherently alien and weird. A monstrosity, to hijack the words of Claire Colebrook, that we do not feel, live, or determine, but rather witness partially and ex post facto. And these are not from the thing, but these are other creatures from horror movies. How these processes are comprehended, or more precisely, how the perception of these processes is interpreted, is more important than the so-called difference between the world which existed before and the world which remains after. Eugene Thacker clarifies this point in his analysis of the etymology of the word monster. A monster is never just a monster, never just a physical or biological anomaly. It is always accompanied by an interpretive framework, within which the monster is able to be monstrum, literally to show or to warn. Monsters are always a matter of interpretation. So here's my interpretation. In a 1982 New York Times movie section, critic Vincent Canby poured yet more scorn on John Carpenter's The Thing. And this is Canby. The Thing is a foolish, depressing, overproduced movie that mixes horror with science fiction to make something that is fun neither as one thing nor the other. There may be a metaphor in all this, but I doubt it. The Thing is too phony looking to be disgusting. It qualifies only as instant junk. Chiming with his critic peers, Canby expresses his desire that the monster show its nature, be monstrum, only in respect of some norm, some interpretive framework that the narrative will eventually uncover. By setting up junk as a kitschy opposite to this supposedly palatable logic, Canby unwittingly generates a point from which to disrupt the very notion of the interpretive framework itself. The Thing is more than a metaphor. Canby's appeal to instant junk can be read as the monstrum, the revealing of that which constitutes the norm. The monster stands in for difference, for other, and in so doing normalizes the subject position from which that difference is opposed, the canon. In the case of The Thing, that canon is first and foremost the human male, standing astride the idea of a world for us. The us is monopolized, as if all non-male ontogenetic permutations were cast out into the same abject abyss of alien weirdness. In reclaiming junk as a register of the unrepresentable, a thingly discourse may share many of the tenets of queer theory, as Rosie Braidotti makes clear, referring to the work of Camilla Gregers. Queer is no longer the noun that marks an identity they taught us to despise, but it has become a verb that destabilizes any claims to identity, even and especially to a sex-specific identity, end quote. The queer, the weird, the kitsch are powerful because they are inherently unrepresentable and in flux. The rigid delineations of language and cultural heteronormativity are further joined in the figure of the Thing by a non-anthropic imaginary that exposes a whole range of human norms and sets into play a seemingly infinite variety of non-human modes of being and embodiment. Rosie Braidotti refers to the work of George Canguilhem in her further turn outwards toward the weird. Normality, she says, is, after all, the 0 degree of monstrosity. This signals perhaps what I might call a post-human discourse, as one by which definition must continually question, perhaps even threaten, the male, self-same, canonized subject position. And this is Rosie Braidotti. We need to learn to think of the anomalous, the monstrously different, not as a sign of perduration, but as the unfolding of virtual possibilities, that point to positive alternatives for us all. The human is now displaced in the direction of a glittering range of post-human variables. In her book on the death of the post-human, Claire Colebrook looks to the otherwise, the unrepresentable, to destabilize the proposition of a world being for anyone at all. She begins by considering the proposed name of the geological era, the Anthropocene, a term that designates a theoretical as well as scientific impasse for human beings and civilization. As if registering the inevitable extinctions of humans isn't enough, the Anthropocene, by being named in honor of humans, makes monsters of those times, past and present, which do not contain humans. Its naming, therefore, becomes a mechanism allowing the imagination of a viewing or reading in the absence of viewers or readers. The world without bodies that is imaged in this move, Colebrook argues, is written upon by the current state of impending extinction. Humans are then able to look upon the future world without us in a state of nostalgia, colored by their inevitable absence. Here, the tenets of the horror genre indicated by Thacker and others are realized as a feature of the present condition. The world in itself has already been subsumed by the thingly horror that is the human species. For even the coming world without us, a planet made barren and utterly replaced by the thingly junk of human civilization, will have written within its geological record a mark of human activity that goes back well before the human species had considered itself a thing in any world at all. In another analysis of the etymology of the Anthropocene, Mackenzie Wark turns to theory as a necessary condition in the age of extinction. And this is Wark. All of the interesting and useful movements in the humanities since the late 20th century have critiqued and dissented from the theologies of the human. The Anthropocene, by contrast, calls for thinking something that is not even defeat. The Anthropocene, like queer or weird, could be made into a verb and relinquished as a noun. Once weirded in this way, it becomes a productive proposition. Quoting Donna Haraway, Mackenzie Wark goes on, it could become another figure, 1,000 names of something else. In the 2014 lecture quoted by Wark, Haraway called for other such worldings through the horrific figure of capitalism, through arachnids spinning their silk from the waste matter of the underworld, or from the terrible nightmares evoked in the fiction of the misogynist, racist, mid-20th century author H.P. Lovecraft. And she calls for the weird-going epoch of the Thulucene, which many of you will know, a monster defined by the frightening weirdness of being impossibly bound up with other organisms, of what Haraway calls multi-species muddles. The horror of the nameless thing is here finally brought to bear in Haraway's Capitalocene or Thulucene epochs. Haraway's call for 1,000 names of something else is thingly in its push towards the endlessly bifurcated naming and theoretical subsuming. The anthronormalization casts out infinitely more possibilities than it brings into play. Although Donna Haraway makes it clear that her Thulucene is not directly derivative of H.P. Lovecraft's Thulu mythos, her intentional misnaming and slippery non-identification exemplifies the kind of amorphous thinking and practice she is arguing for. Haraway's Thulucene counters Lovecraft's Thulu with an array of thlonic, non-male, tentacular, rhizomatic, and web-spinning figures that attest to the monster still exposed by Lovecraft's 3/4-of-a-century-old work. The continued, perhaps renewed fascination with Lovecraft's weird others thus has a capacity to expose a dread of these times. This is a longish quote by Alan Moore, which I think is really significant in understanding Lovecraft and the weird. It is possible to perceive Howard Lovecraft as an almost unbearably sensitive barometer of American dread. Far from outlandish eccentricities, the fears that generated Lovecraft's stories and opinions were precisely those of the white, middle-class, heterosexual, Protestant-descended males who were most threatened by the shifting power relationships and values of the modern world. Coded in an alphabet of monsters, Lovecraft's writings offer a potential key to understanding our current dilemma, although crucial to this is that they are understood in the full context of the place and times from which they blossomed. So I'm just going to jump ahead a second. As Donna Haraway calls for not just naming, but of doing, of making new kinds of labor for a new kind of nature, contemporary modes of critique, and perhaps more importantly, actions and interventions, should be encouraged to take on the form of the monsters that they pursue, molding and transforming our labors into composite hybrid figures that never settle into one form, lest they become stable, rigid, and normalized. In fact, this metaphor itself is conditioned too readily by the notion of a mastery that mankind can wield. Rather, our inquiries and actions must be encouraged to monster separately, to blur and mutate beyond the human capacity to understand them, to revel at the limits of what we consider to be human life, like the infinite variety of organisms Haraway insists the future opens onto. The very image of a post-human must avoid normalizing monsters and rendering them through our analyses and expression of the world for us. And for Eugene Thacker, this is the power of science fiction horror, to take aim at the suppositions of philosophical inquiry that the world is always for us and make of those blind spots its central concern, expressing them not in abstract concepts, but in a whole bestiary of impossible life forms, mists, ooze, blobs, slime, clouds, and muck. Reflecting on the work of Noel Carroll, Rosie Braidotti argues that if science fiction horror is based on the disturbance of cultural norms, it is then ideally placed to represent states of crisis and change and to express the widespread anxiety of our times. As such, this genre is as unstoppable as the transformation it mirrors. So just to finish up, I want to go back to the original poster for the thing. And its tagline was, "Man is the warmest place to hide." And I think if we read this through contemporary events and contemporary situations, then we get this understanding of man as the warmest place to hide. The figure of man astride, in control, with their fragility very safely tucked away. And I don't have the absolute mechanisms of how we become these transfiguring, changing, altering monsters in our modes of action, but rather than think of these guys as the thing, I think we need to become thing-like in our capacity to respond to these strange creatures that seem to be in control of much of our world. We need to bring them out of their hiding. So yeah, that's how I'm going to finish today. Thanks very much.